Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Our Palestine Question, Israel and American Jewish Dissent, 1948 to 1978. By Geoffrey Levin. Narrated by Jonathan Todd Ross. Introduction. The Muddy Roads of Shatila. On a cold and rainy November day, a 65-year-old American rabbi trudged down the muddy roads of Shatila, a Palestinian refugee camp on the outskirts of Beirut in Lebanon. When the rabbi and his colleagues stopped, refugees gathered around them in a scene of disappointment, frustration, and despair. Gaunt men and children, big-eyed and thin, walked up and clutched the rabbi's raincoat. Several began chanting in Arabic, "We want to go home." Weary, broken women watched silently from their tents as rain and wind chilled their bare feet. Guilt overcame the rabbi. "In my deepest heart I said the prayer of confession," the rabbi wrote, referring to a prayer recited on Yom Kippur, the Fast of Atonement. Anachnu chatanu. We have sinned. One can imagine this scene taking place recently, or at least sometime after the 1982 massacre that made Shatila infamous. Yet it was 1953, when Rabbi Morris Lazaran walked through the Shatila refugee camp, witnessing firsthand the suffering of Palestinian families who had lost their homes during the war that accompanied Israel's creation in 1948. The illimitable misery of the refugees, to use Lazaran's words, had a decisive impact on the former head rabbi of the prestigious Baltimore Hebrew congregation. After his trip, Rabbi Lazaran began calling on the Israeli government to recognize the right of Palestine's Arab refugees to return to their pre-war homes, and urged the Jewish state to admit 100,000 of them into the country immediately. Lazaran felt that the Jewish historical experience should compel all Jews to support the Palestinian refugees. As members of what he called the tribe of the wandering feet, Lazaran pressed fellow American Jews to remember that they too were once strangers in the land of Egypt. Jewish identity weighed heavily on the rabbi's mind as he considered how to respond to Palestinian suffering. Yet the hidden context of the rabbi's trip reveals that the stakes of his response extended far beyond the realm of Jewish ethics. Lazaran's visit to Lebanon had been organized and financed by a secretly CIA-funded advocacy organization called American Friends of the Middle East, AFME. A group created to give Americans a more sympathetic picture of the Arab side of the Israeli-Arab conflict. AFME published Lazaran's book about the trip in 1955, apparently as part of a broader public relations effort that aimed to make it easier for United States officials to pressure Israel to accept the return of 75,000 Palestinian refugees. The CIA was far from the only government body interested in American Jewish responses to the Palestinian refugee crisis. Lazaran articulated his lament on a playing field where various governmental actors, Israeli, American, and Arab, all jockeyed to shape U.S. public opinion surrounding the Palestinian refugee question. Just as AFME was organizing Lazaran's trip, Israeli diplomats were quietly working to undermine both the Jewish newspaper that Lazaran wrote for and the anti-Zionist Jewish group he represented, the American Council for Judaism, which in turn had begun fostering warm ties with Arab officials. The American Jewish debate over Palestinian rights involved a struggle over Jewish identity, as Lazaran's words reflect. But as his broader story shows, the debate also is, and always has been, part of a high-stakes political struggle between government officials and others over the future of Israel, the fate of the Palestinians, and the orientation of American foreign policy toward the Middle East. There is a narrative about the trajectory of the American-Jewish relationship with Israel that pervades all corners of the organized Jewish community today. For millions of secular-minded American Jews, Israel was the glue. Israel was the cause, declared conservative commentator Bret Stephens at the American Jewish Committee's AJC 2022 Global Forum. Zionism was an effective and powerful and emotionally satisfying substitute for religious observance, he continued, bemoaning that in contrast, at the height of last year's war, the 2021 Gaza crisis, so many young American Jews were eagerly signing letters denouncing Israeli behavior. While young American Jewish letter signers may not appreciate Stephens' tone, they probably would not dispute the gist of his historical observation, which is considered common knowledge both in Jewish political commentary and in scholarly works. For decades, American Jews had rallied around the Jewish state, with Israel uniting American Jewry in a way that nothing else could, including religion. But then, at some point, according to this telling, young left-wing Jews began criticizing Israel over its policies toward the Palestinians, breaking with past generations to shatter this once sacred consensus and imperil any semblance of Jewish unity. Despite its ubiquity, this narrative is flawed in its basic assumptions. Ever since an estimated 750,000 Palestinians lost their homes amidst Israel's birth in 1948, there have been American Jews deeply unsettled by Israeli policies toward both the Palestinian refugees and Arabs living under Israeli rule. These critics of old did not consist only of a few stray rabbis like Morris Lazarin, but in fact extended well into the American Jewish establishment, including leaders and staff members of the AJC. The collective amnesia with regard to this history has been complete. None of the over 1,000 AJC members in Stephens' audience likely had any idea that in 1957, their organization's president confronted Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, urging him to liberalize Israel's policies toward its Arab citizens. The audience would not have known that at an AJC gala 66 years before their own, the Jewish advocacy organization announced a plan to aid Palestinian refugees that it ultimately shelved in response to Israeli pressure. And unless they had sifted through faded yellow papers in their archives, they could not have known that the first Middle East expert on the AJC staff, Don Peretz, lost his job because Israeli diplomats did not like his research on the Palestinian refugee issue. Stephens and his audience cannot be faulted for being unaware of these past events, because they are more or less unknown. Histories of American Jewish life make almost no mention of any communal concern for the Palestinians in the years after Israel's creation, implying that it emerged, at the earliest, in the 1970s. Even studies of Jewish anti-Zionism and non-Zionism during Israel's early years have tended to neglect the Palestinian question, focusing instead on debates over the role of nationalism in Jewish identity. Our Palestine question reveals that Israel's policies toward the Palestinians did indeed create dilemmas for American Jewish individuals, organizations, and publications during the first 3 decades of the new country's history. These American Jews engaged in rhetoric and activities that aimed to help the Palestinians for a confluence of reasons that included anxieties about antisemitism, demands for consistency in values, and inspiration through direct contact with Arab and left-wing Israeli voices. These efforts arose in a context of disconnect between dominant forms of American Jewish liberalism and Israel's overall disposition toward the Palestinians. This disconnect emerged because Zionism, as implemented in Israel, contradicted some of the core values that American Jews had championed in their push for an inclusive America. Jewish advocacy organizations spent decades working to ensure that the United States would not simply be a country premised on advancing the interests of the white Christian majority, but rather a secular state with equality for all. As a self-declared Jewish state, Israel prioritized Jewish interests over the needs of non-Jews born in the lands that it controlled. This was clear in its immigration policy, which welcomed all Jews while preventing Palestinian refugees from returning to their homes. It also manifested itself domestically in that until 1966, Israel's Arab minority, despite receiving Israeli citizenship in 1952, faced many onerous military government restrictions that Jewish Israelis barely knew about. Israeli leaders justified policies that protected and privileged the ethno-national majority in part as a defensive response to centuries of anti-Jewish persecution, expulsions, and genocide in Europe and elsewhere. In contrast, for many American Jews, this same history led them to identify with other beleaguered minorities and dispossessed peoples. While Israel and Jewish refugees most often earned American Jewish sympathy, it should be no surprise that there was always some undercurrent of American Jewish empathy for the Palestinians. The fact that this historical undercurrent is so unknown is, to some extent, the result of concerted campaigns. From the beginning, Israeli diplomats watched American Jewish interest in Palestinian rights issues with deep suspicion. Declassified Israeli Foreign Ministry files reveal that some of Israel's most celebrated diplomats secretly plotted to undermine American Jews who wrote about the sensitive question of Palestinian refugees, often succeeding in getting them removed from positions of influence. These diplomats persuaded reluctant employers to drop troublesome employees whom they had once trusted, quietly sidelining various American Jewish efforts to highlight or resolve Palestinian rights issues in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. These findings call for a rethinking of the very nature of the early Israel-American Jewish relationship. So much written about this era focuses on the emotional affinities that American Jews held for Israel, but far less has been written on Israel's views of American Jewry. Rather than acting from a place of emotional connection and intracommunal kinship, Israeli officials acted in pragmatic ways toward the American Jewish community in the context of a wider public relations battle that raged between them and pro-Arab voices, which included Arab diplomats and some in the U.S. government. Israel, during its early years, was in a precarious place, as it faced an economic crisis, high security costs, and the expense of resettling hundreds of thousands of Jewish immigrants. To meet these budgetary needs, the Israeli government turned to American Jews, who between 1948 and 1956 sent Israel more than $700 million in charitable donations and over $270 million in cash from bond sales, a combined sum that would total over $10 billion in 2022 dollars. American supporters of Israel, including Jews, also lobbied elected officials on diplomatic issues and successfully urged the government to send economic aid to Israel, which totaled $450 million, around $5 billion today, in combined loans and grants during that same 8-year stretch. Since the young country was reliant on American Jewish support in so many ways, perhaps it should be expected that its officials acted to ensure that the question of Palestinian rights did not weaken American Jewry's commitment to Israel, harm Israel's public image, and damage the U.S. Israel relationship more broadly. Israel was, in short, acting as any state might given the circumstances. To a certain extent, this book shows that Israeli leaders instrumentalized American Jewish organizations, which highlights the power of the young state and the political savvy of its diplomats. But to focus only on that would be an oversimplification. American Jewish organizations first had to yield some of their autonomy to the Jewish state. Doing so involved American Jews beginning to conceptualize their interests and ideals not as distinct from those of Israel, but as identical to them, a process that blurred crucial differences between the community and the state. This required that these organizations turn away from a distinctive American Jewish identity as a historically dispossessed minority that has thrived in a liberal secular state, and instead adopt the values of Israel, a country premised on meeting the needs of an ethno-national majority. To frame the question underlying this shift in biblical terms, as Rabbi Lazaron might have, is the core of Jewish identity remembering that we were once strangers in the land of Egypt, or is it all about maintaining a restored kingdom of David? American Jews of the 1940s, 1950s, and beyond often had remarkably deep conversations about the meaning of Israel's power over Palestinians. In recovering this history, our Palestine question serves not so much as a starting point for discussion, but more precisely as a medium that will inform conversations that are already taking place today and engage them with lost voices from the past. From there, one can see how the path to the present involved not fate, but crucial decisions made over the course of decades that have shaped the politics of today's surrounding Israel, the Palestinians, and the nature of transnational Jewish politics. In delving into this history, this book sheds light on political dynamics that at times feel very distant from those of the present. The American Jewish establishment did not always view anti-Zionism as inherently anti-Semitic. Some Jewish community leaders considered themselves non-Zionist until years after Israel's founding. American Jewish institutions that had been established long before 1948 took time to accommodate themselves to the reality of Jewish statehood, a process that involved countless discussions about what Jewish sovereignty overseas meant for Jewish citizens of the United States. Jews had been a perpetual minority, so many American Jewish institutions had mobilized around liberal and left-leaning ideologies designed to protect minority groups and those seeking refuge. Suddenly, after 1948, there was a Jewish state that not only ruled over a non-Jewish minority group, but also denied the right of refugees to return to their homes on the basis of their ethnicity and religion. Israel's birth created a sense of cognitive dissonance for these American Jewish organizations as they attempted to come to terms with Israel's power over the Palestinians without abandoning the ideologies that they regularly used to protect the rights of Jews outside the Jewish state. The mainstream organization that struggled most with these questions was the American Jewish Committee, which Israel considered the single most politically influential Jewish group in the United States during the 1950s. As political scientist Charles Liebman wrote, "There is no question that, for more than a decade after 1948, the American Jewish Committee was the Jewish organization to whose views Israeli leaders were most sensitive, since they perceived the AJC as the Jewish organization with the best access to American policymakers and as the most representative of wealthy American Jews." While in later decades Zionist groups like the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC or AIPAC, and umbrella organizations like the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations grew to hold greater political sway. At the start of the 1950s, neither of these groups yet existed. While compared with the AJC, Zionist groups had far greater membership, they lacked unity, and no individual Zionist organization could match AJC leaders in terms of financial strength and political connections. So for a pivotal period from the 1940s to the 1960s, one of Israel's most important links to Washington and to American Jewish pocketbooks lay with the American Jewish Committee. The AJC's leadership, however, was not exactly sure how it wished to relate to the Jewish state. Established in 1906 by an affluent and Americanized Reform Jewish elite to advocate for persecuted Jewish minorities throughout the world, with the passing of World War II, the AJC began to conceive of itself as a universalist human rights organization. With regard to Israel, the AJC stood apart from many other Jewish groups because of its reluctance to endorse Zionism, referring to itself as non-Zionist until 1967. The group's uneasiness about Jewish nationalism stemmed in part from its leadership's belief that Jews were solely a religious group, rather than a nationality. But it also came amidst fears that Zionism would potentially raise doubts about American Jews' loyalty to the United States, a dual loyalty anxiety stoked by both Zionist and anti-Zionist rhetoric. This concern prompted AJC President Jacob Blaustein to compel Israeli Prime Minister Ben-Gurion to clarify that Israel made no claims on the political loyalties of non-Israeli Jews in an agreement known as the 1950 Blaustein-Ben-Gurion Exchange of Views. Much of this book centers on the AJC's internal struggles and the group's interactions with various Israeli and Arab officials. In the aftermath of 1948, AJC officials viewed Israel as a potential source of problems for American Jews, in part because of its policies toward the Palestinians, but eventually they would come to see the fate of Israel and American Jewry as inextricably linked. That newfound perception would lead the AJC to begin including the task of defending Israel's image within its mission to combat antisemitism, a shift made subtly despite its historic implications. Jewish anti-Zionism, which has a varied history in America that precedes the creation of Israel by decades, factors into this story in a chapter focusing on the American Council for Judaism, referred to here as the Council. Formed in 1942 by a group of Reform rabbis unsettled by their denomination's endorsement of Zionist aims, the Council's concerns about Zionism echoed those of the AJC, but it felt that the AJC's non-Zionism was too mild a response. Rather, Council leaders publicly campaigned against Zionism, viewing Jewish statehood as a potential catastrophe for American foreign policy, for their conception of Judaism, and for the position of Jews in the United States. The Council instead envisioned Palestine's future as a non-sectarian democracy for all its citizens and encouraged U.S. leaders to coordinate with the United Nations to settle displaced Holocaust survivors in countries throughout the world. After the Council failed to prevent Israel's creation in 1948, a schism slowly formed within the organization as some of its leaders began advocating for Palestinians, while others, influenced in part by Israeli officials, urged for a much more subdued approach. The conflict between the Council's two factions would ultimately rip the group apart at its seams. In connection with the AJC and the Council, this book's first 5 chapters delve into the lives of an interconnected set of individuals, who collectively could be termed the lost first generation of American Jews to advocate for Palestinians, given that they were active between 1948 and 1967. The Jews who made up this loose network included academic Don Peretz, 1922 to 2017, journalist William Zuckerman, 1885 to 1961, attorney and philanthropist James Marshall, 1896 to 1987, of the AJC, Rabbi Elmer Berger, 1908 to 1994, of the Council, and their affiliates. Of these, the book's most central figure is Peretz, who was, without a doubt, more deeply involved with Palestinian affairs than any other American Jew of his generation. Born in Baltimore to an Ashkenazi American Jewish mother and a Sephardic Zionist father who had recently emigrated from Ottoman Palestine, Peretz covered the 1948 war as a journalist, and in 1949 became the first American Jew to volunteer to aid displaced Palestinians. He then wrote the very first doctoral dissertation on the Palestinian refugee problem, and became a leading academic expert on the topic. In 1956, the AJC hired Peretz to put together a Palestinian refugee aid initiative, which Israeli diplomats worked hard to oppose. This book also excavates the story of a fascinating Palestinian who was Peretz's acquaintance and, in some ways, his mirror image. Born the same year as Peretz to a Palestinian mother and a Syrian father, Fayez Sayegh, 1922 to 1980, was completing a Ph.D. in philosophy at Georgetown University when the creation of Israel in 1948 prevented him from ever returning to Tiberias, the city in Palestine, Israel, where he had grown up. In the early 1950s, Sayegh began associating with AFME, but was likely unaware of its covert CIA funding. AFME sponsored his lectures about Palestine and other Arab causes, providing him a platform in Washington and elsewhere in the country. When the Arab League opened a new public relations office in the United States in 1955, Sayegh became its chief spokesman and served as the office's director during the critical year of 1956, when the Suez Crisis and ensuing Sinai War shook up international politics. Given that Sayegh was the most active advocate for the Palestinian cause in 1950s America, the ways in which Jewish groups from across the political spectrum responded to him reveal much about how they conceived of the connection between anti-Zionism and antisemitism. Though some today remember Sayegh for his crucial role in the 1975 United Nations vote declaring Zionism a form of racism, and for founding the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO Research Center, this book is the first to recall in detail his centrality in American discourse about the Middle East in the 1950s, which, together with his later actions, makes him arguably the most important Palestinian voice in America until Edward Said's emergence in the 1970s. While only one chapter focuses on Sayegh, his presence looms throughout much of this book. Our Palestine question ends by moving past the stories of the first generation of American Jews concerned with Palestinian rights to those of the second generation, a cohort whose history has not been lost, but has often been mischaracterized. This larger, younger, and more diverse network became vocal only after 1967. Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, that began with the Six-Day War that year, exacerbated the Palestinian plight, provoking responses from an array of voices on the New Left, including some Black and Arab American groups that vocalized solidarity with the Palestinians more forcefully than ever before. Some American Jews were among those voices, but within the realm of organized American Jewish politics, a new group pushing for Palestinian statehood emerged, not just with a leftist, but also with a Zionist pedigree. Founded in 1973, Brera, a project of concern in diaspora-Israel relations, became the first national Jewish organization in the United States to advocate for the creation of a Palestinian state alongside Israel, a proposal now widely referred to as the two-state solution. Brera, which means alternative in Hebrew, came to this position not out of disdain for Israel, but because its members believed that achieving Palestinian national self-determination would help secure Israel's future. The group's stated support for Israel, however, would not protect it from getting caught in the political crossfire between Palestinian and Israeli officials.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?